Welcome back, everyone. I'm so glad you're here today because this story is something special. It's about unexpected connections, difficult choices, and a moment that changed everything. If you enjoy relaxing storytelling like this, take a second to like the video. It really helps the channel grow. And feel free to say hello in the comments. I read every single one. Now, let's begin.
Nobody could touch the Mafia boss's daughter. Not the $500 an hour specialists. Not the nannies who quit after 2 weeks. Not even her own father. Until a waitress making $15 an hour did what none of them could. That night, Nero's was packed. Chicago's elite filling every table. $800 wine flowing like water. And in the back corner behind 2 armed bodyguards sat Ash Verano, 37 years old, the most powerful and most feared man on the entire East Side, owner of a real estate empire worth hundreds of millions that everyone knew was built on blood, a man who'd ordered people killed with nothing more than a nod of his head, sitting there in his 3-piece black suit with a Patek Philippe on his wrist. And he couldn't do a single thing for his own 5-year-old daughter screaming under the table. Ruby had autism, and when the world got too loud, too bright, too close, her little body just shut down. And that night, it shut down hard. She was curled up on the floor, covering her ears, rocking back and forth, repeating the same word over and over. Stop, stop, stop. And every specialist Ash had ever hired, every expert, every therapist, every doctor with fancy degrees and thick folders, none of them had ever been able to reach her when she got like this. And what nobody in that restaurant knew, what Ash Verano had never told a single living soul, was that Ruby had never met her mother because Leah had been shot and killed when Ruby was just 3 months old, caught in what everyone believed was a gang crossfire. And Ash had buried that guilt so deep, he couldn't even look at his own daughter without seeing his dead wife's eyes staring back at him. So he'd done what powerful men do. He threw money at the problem, hired the best people, built walls of security around his little girl, gave her everything money could buy. But he was never truly there. Never once sat on the floor beside her. Never once just stayed quiet long enough for her to feel safe. And tonight it showed because Ruby was falling apart, and the most dangerous man in Chicago was on his knees, completely powerless. The manager rushed over. A waiter tried to help. A bodyguard moved in, and Ruby only screamed louder. And that's when a waitress named June Peretti, 27 years old, walked straight past the bodyguards without permission, without being called, and did something that left every single person in that restaurant stunned. She knelt down on that cold floor about 3 feet from Ruby, and she did absolutely nothing. She just sat there in silence, and what she'd do in the next few minutes wouldn't just calm a screaming child. It would crack open the heart of a mafia boss, expose a family secret buried for 18 years, and change the lives of everyone involved forever. If this story moves you, smash that like button so more people can hear it. Share it with someone who needs to believe that love still wins, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Now let's go back to that restaurant floor, where a waitress is kneeling in silence, and a mafia boss is about to witness something he can't explain. The entire restaurant froze as if someone had just pressed pause. Forks and knives suspended in midair. Wine glasses halted just before lips. Conversations cut off in the middle of themselves. And more than 100 people in the most elegant restaurant in Chicago were all staring in the same direction, toward the night shift waitress, kneeling on the cold floor 3 feet away from the screaming child without moving at all. Ash Verano dropped down right beside her, close enough for her to catch the scent of expensive cologne at the collar of his suit, and his voice came low, thick, and full of menace in the way that men who had heard that voice for the last time before vanishing forever would recognize instantly. "What the hell are you doing?" June didn't turn back, didn't look at him, didn't show a flicker of fear even though the most notorious mafia boss in the city had just growled into her ear. She only kept her eyes on the wooden floor, her voice so soft Ash had to lean closer to hear it clearly, waiting for her to let me exist in her world. Ash didn't understand that sentence. He didn't understand why a waitress making $15 an hour was speaking as if she knew something his $500 an hour specialists had never even come close to touching. And his first instinct was to pull her to her feet, drag her away from this, because Ash Verano wasn't a man who let strangers get close to his daughter, wasn't a man who let anyone do anything he hadn't ordered. But just as his hand started to rise, another hand touched his shoulder from behind, firm, heavy, familiar, Knox Draper, 42 years old, 15 years at Ash's back, a man who had seen everything, from executions in dark alleyways to million-dollar negotiations behind closed doors, and Knox almost never interfered with the boss's decisions. But tonight he shook his head, only once, so slightly it was nearly invisible. Yet enough for Ash to understand. Wait, let her try. Knox couldn't have explained why. It was simply the instinct of a man who had survived 15 years in the underworld by reading people more accurately than any lie detector ever could, and that instinct was telling him the girl kneeling on the floor wasn't a threat. She knew something. Ash lowered his hand, but his jaw remained clenched, his eyes never leaving June, tracking every smallest movement the way he watched an opponent in a negotiation room, searching for a sign of deception, searching for a hidden motive, searching for anything at all that would prove this girl was playing some kind of game. But he found nothing except a calmness so strange. It was almost infuriating. A few steps away, Felicity Tran stood beside the bar with both arms folded across her chest. And while the entire restaurant held its breath in worry or emotion, Felicity's eyes were something else entirely. Sharp, cold, calculating. She had managed Nero's long enough to know who this restaurant truly belonged to. Long enough to know that Ash Verano's attention was a form of power that could raise someone up or bury them beneath the ground. And at that moment, all of that attention was fixed on a night shift waitress. Felicity hadn't even bothered to remember by name until this evening, and it irritated her in exactly the way ambitious people are irritated when they see someone else receiving what they believe they deserved more. Felicity said nothing. She only watched, took note, and began arranging everything in her mind in the way that would later bring consequences no one in the restaurant that night could possibly foresee. 30 seconds passed. 60 seconds. 90 seconds. 90 seconds of absolute silence in a restaurant with more than 100 people. No clink of silverware, no sound of glass, no breath. 90 seconds that felt longer to Ash Verano than any negotiation he had ever sat through. Longer than the night he stood in a hospital waiting for the doctor to tell him Leah was gone. Longer than anything he had ever endured. Because at least in those moments he could still do something. Give an order, pay someone, make a threat. But here, on the floor of his own restaurant, all he could do was kneel and wait. And Ash Verano wasn't the kind of man who knew how to wait. Ruby was still crying, but the sound had changed. It was no longer that tearing scream. It had become smaller, wearier sobs, as if her body was giving out but still hadn't found a reason to stop. And June was still there, unmoving, patient, as if she could remain like that all night if she had to, as if she had done this 100 times before. And the truth was, she had. Only Ash didn't know that yet. Didn't know that the girl kneeling on the cold floor of his restaurant tonight was carrying inside her a story that could shatter everything he thought he knew about his own life. And what she was about to do next would become the moment that made the most ruthless mafia boss in Chicago feel, for the first time, completely out of control. Not because of fear, but because something he had believed he buried long ago had just begun to crack. And then June moved, for the first time since she had knelt onto the floor, but not in any way anyone in the restaurant had been expecting. She didn't reach toward Ruby, didn't say a word, didn't try to pull the little girl out from under the table the way everyone before her had tried and failed. Instead, she only used one finger, the index finger of her right hand, and began to tap softly against the wooden floor. Steady, slow, like a heartbeat. Tuck, tuck, tuck. A sound so small it was almost swallowed by Ruby's sobs. But it was there, patient, unhurried, unbroken, and it wasn't something June had read in a textbook or learned from any specialist, but something she had discovered alone in the dark, after hundreds of nights lying beside her sister on the narrow bed in their $400 a month rented room on the south side, when Paige would have an episode in the middle of the night and there was no one there but June. No doctor, no medicine, nothing at all except her finger tapping steadily against the bed frame until Paige stopped shaking and drifted to sleep. Night after night, year after year, until that rhythm had become an instinct carved so deeply into her body it was like breathing. Ruby stopped sobbing. Not all at once, but little by little. The way waves retreat from the shore, the crying softened, the hiccuping grew farther apart, and the little girl's eyes, squeezed shut ever since the meltdown began, slowly opened, not looking at June, not looking at anyone, only at the finger tapping on the floor, following that steady rhythm as if it were the only thing in this whole chaotic restaurant she could bear. Ash watched his daughter growing calmer, and didn't dare breathe, didn't dare move. because he had lived with Ruby long enough to know that any sudden sound, any movement at all, could send her tumbling straight back into the abyss, and he looked at June with the eyes of a man witnessing something his reason couldn't explain. Then June stopped tapping. The whole restaurant held its breath. She slowly turned her right hand over, placed it on the floor, her palm open, and beneath the golden candlelight spilling from the VIP table, a scar came into view, clear and long, running from the base of her wrist down through the center of her palm. The skin tightened there, wrinkled and faintly glossy, a scar not from a knife, not self-inflicted, but from the night June was 16 and had used her bare arm to shield Paige from a shattered window during a meltdown, glass cutting so deep June could see bone, yet she never went to get stitches because she had no insurance. She wrapped it herself with a kitchen towel and worked the morning shift the next day because she couldn't afford to lose even one day's pay. And that scar had healed but never disappeared. It had stayed with her for 11 years, following her through every job, every rented room, every sleepless night. The only thing left from her sister besides the pain. June didn't hide the scar, didn't cover it, only laid her open hand on the cold floor and waited. Not inviting, not pressing, not saying a single word. Ruby stared at that hand for a long time, her eyes moving from the fingers to the wrist, to the scar, and something in the gaze of the 5-year-old child changed. Not understanding in the way adults understand, but something deeper than that, more instinctive, the thing children like Ruby feel before language is able to give it a name, safety, truth, and she reached out her tiny hand, slowly, trembling, and placed one finger against June's scar, only one finger, her little finger, so lightly it almost didn't touch at all. But it was there, the Mafia boss's daughter's tiny finger resting on the 11-year-old scar of the night shift waitress. And that moment hit Ash Verano harder than any bullet he had ever dodged, harder than any blow he had ever taken, because in the 5 years since Leah was gone, not one specialist, not one nanny, not even Ash himself, had been touched by Ruby in a voluntary way like that. His jaw locked so tightly, his teeth hurt, his eyes burned, but not from anger, from something rising up from the deepest place in his chest, a place he had sealed shut on the night he stood in the morgue identifying his wife's body. And he had to look away because Ash Verano didn't cry. Ash Verano had never cried in front of anyone since that night, but tonight, on the floor of his own restaurant, he was dangerously close to that edge. June smiled, gently, only the faintest lift at the corner of her mouth, and whispered in the softest voice she had, "Hi, Ruby, I'm June." Ruby didn't answer with words, but she didn't pull her finger back, and for anyone who understood autism, for anyone who had ever lived with a child for whom the outside world was too big, too loud, too bright, too frightening, that tiny finger resting still on a stranger's scar wasn't a small thing, it was everything. It was a door opening without being forced. And then Ruby moved, on her own, with no one pulling her, no one coaxing. She slowly crawled out from under the table, inch by inch, still keeping her finger on June's hand as if afraid of losing whatever it was she had just found, and sat down beside the night shift waitress on the cold floor of the most elegant restaurant in Chicago. The two of them, one small and one grown, sitting together in the silence, and all of Nero's exhaled at once, more than 100 people, a collective breath spilling out as softly as wind, and no one in that restaurant that night, not Ash Verano, not Knox Draper, not even Felicity Tran standing beside the bar, with her eyes narrowed now into 2 calculating slits, knew that what had just happened on that restaurant floor was only the beginning, and that the secret the waitress carried inside her, the secret of that scar, of the sister she had lost, of the clinic that had been shut down, would pull behind it the collapse of everything Ash Verano believed was true about his own family. What happened next made Ash doubt his own eyes, because Ruby, the 5-year-old girl who had never once managed to eat a meal anywhere, except in the familiar room of the penthouse with the lights adjusted to exactly the right brightness and the noise controlled down to every decibel, that little girl rose from the floor on her own, climbed into her chair on her own, sat at the table on her own, and when the plate of pasta was set in front of her, she picked up her fork and ate. No screaming, no shoving the plate away, no crawling back under the table, just eating, slowly, quietly, one bite at a time, as if the storm that had torn through her 10 minutes earlier had never existed at all, and somehow June had already gone back to serving the other tables, carrying trays, pouring water, writing down orders, as if she hadn't just done the very thing that 20 specialists paid $500 an hour had failed to do, as if it were only an ordinary part of her shift. And it was that attitude, that normalcy, that unsettled Ash in a way he couldn't name, because in his world everyone wanted something, everyone had a price, and a girl who had just done the impossible without asking for anything either was playing a very sophisticated game or was something he had never encountered in 37 years of living among deceit and blood. Ruby finished the entire plate of pasta, every last bit of it, something even the best nanny would only have dreamed of. And when Ash looked at the empty plate, he felt something that was both shame and pain, because he had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on nutritionists, pediatricians, feeding therapy. Yet his daughter still refused to eat in public every time he took her out. But tonight, on the floor of his own restaurant, a waitress who hadn't cost him a single cent had managed it with nothing but silence and an open hand. When it was time to leave, Ash signaled for Knox to get the car ready. Then he rose, fastened his suit jacket, and walked to the bar where June was stacking glasses. He didn't look at her. He simply pulled a thick stack of cash from the inner pocket of his jacket and set it on the counter. $5,000, all $100 bills, arranged neatly the way Ash did everything. Precise, clean, nothing extra, nothing missing, and said in the voice of a man accustomed to paying for everything in the world, for what you did. June looked at the stack of money on the counter, then looked up at him, and in that moment, her eyes weren't the eyes of a night shift waitress, making $15 an hour plus tips, but the eyes of someone who had lost more than money could measure, who had given more than money could buy. And she said, her voice calm but steady as steel, "I didn't sell her anything. What I gave her doesn't have a price." Then she lifted her hand and gently pushed the stack of money back toward him across the polished bar. Not with contempt, not for show, simply because she didn't need it, dipped her head once, and said, "Good night, Mr. Verano," before turning away, tray in hand, returning to the tables that were waiting for her, as if the $5,000 on the counter were nothing more than a flyer someone had left there by mistake. Ash stood there, his hand still resting beside the money, and he couldn't remember the last time he had been refused. Couldn't remember the last time anyone had pushed back what he offered without trembling, without apologizing, without explaining themselves at length. Because in his world, people took. They always took. Bodyguards took their salaries, lawyers took their fees, politicians took their envelopes, mistresses took their gifts, nannies took their bonuses and still walked out after 2 weeks. Everyone took, but the girl earning $15 an hour had just pushed $5,000 back at him the way someone might push away a plate of leftovers. And Ash Verano didn't know what to do with that. Knox had already carried Ruby toward the door, the little girl curled easily in the arms of the big man, eyes half closed, fingers still loosely clutching her stuffed rabbit. And as they passed the outer dining section, Ruby suddenly stirred, turned her head back toward the restaurant, her dark brown eyes sweeping over the tables until they found June standing beside table 7, writing down an order, and the little girl lifted her tiny hand and waved, slow, gentle, as if she were afraid that if she waved too hard this moment might shatter, and June saw it. In the middle of writing on her order pad, she looked up at exactly the right second, and waved back, just as softly, just as slowly, with the hand that bore the scar, and the smile on her lips then wasn't the practiced smile of a waitress, but something more private than that, more painful, more tender, the smile of someone who had just seen the shadow of a person she had lost in another person's child. Ash witnessed that wave from where he stood at the bar, and his chest tightened all over again. Because Ruby didn't wave at people. Ruby didn't look at people. Ruby didn't touch people, but tonight she had done all three with a stranger. And he, her father, had never received that from her. Knox came to stand beside him after Ruby had been handed to the bodyguard waiting at the car, and Knox's voice was low, dry, practical as always. "You should look into that girl." Ash didn't answer. He only watched June disappear farther into the inner rows of tables. And on the drive home in the black Maybach, gliding smoothly through the streets of Chicago, Ruby asleep in the back seat, Knox driving, Ash sitting in silence, staring out the window without seeing anything except the image of an open palm on a wooden floor and the stack of cash being pushed back toward him, and he thought about June Peretti more than he was willing to admit. Not because she was beautiful, though she was beautiful in the way wounded people often are, the kind of beauty that doesn't try, doesn't know, doesn't need to, but because she was the first person in a very long time who had made him feel that he lacked something money couldn't buy. And that feeling, to Ash Verano, was more dangerous than any gun. 2 days later, Ash Verano did something he hadn't done once in the 15 years he had spent running the Verano empire. He went back to a place because of one person, not for business, not for negotiation, not because someone needed to die or someone needed to live, but because he couldn't stop thinking about the open hand on the wooden floor and the stack of cash pushed back toward him, and those 2 days had stretched longer than he wanted to admit. He arrived at Nero's at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the dead hour, the restaurant nearly empty, only a few scattered tables occupied, no bodyguards with him because he didn't want anyone to see him coming back here, no knocks because he didn't want to explain himself, just him alone, in a gray suit without a tie, sitting at the farthest corner table, ordering a double espresso he didn't bother to drink, and waiting. June was wiping down tables in the front section when she saw him, and she paused for 1 second. Only 1 second, before going right back to wiping as if a mafia boss sitting in an almost empty restaurant at 3 o'clock in the afternoon were the most ordinary thing in the world. And that calm, unsettled Ash, even as it pulled at his curiosity, because in his world nobody stayed calm in the presence of Ash Verano. People were either afraid, or flattering, or trying to hide their fear with flattery. But this girl wasn't doing any of that. She simply finished wiping the table and walked over to his, not with an order pad, but with empty hands, and then did something no employee at Nero's, no associate, no lawyer, no politician would have dared to do. She pulled out the chair across from Ash and sat down. No permission asked, no hesitation, no bowed head. She just sat, as if the seat belonged to her, and that single act told Ash more than any speech could have. It told him she didn't see him as the boss, didn't see him as the VIP customer, didn't see him as the man all of Chicago feared. She saw him as a father who had lost his way, and she sat because she wanted to, not because he allowed it. Ash looked at her over the cup of cold espresso and asked directly, without circling around it, because Ash Verano never circled around anything. 20 specialists couldn't do what you did. What do you know that they don't? June didn't answer right away. She studied him for a moment, weighing him, not weighing his money or power because she clearly didn't care about either of those things, but weighing whether he truly wanted to know or only wanted to buy an answer. And when she decided that he truly wanted to know, she said, "They know theory. I know because I lived it every single day for 12 years. Then she told him, briefly, without drama, without reaching for pity, in the flat voice of someone who had walked through hell and no longer needed anyone to validate it, that she had a younger sister with severe autism, far more severe than Ruby's, that her mother had walked out when June was 13 and her sister was 6, that she had dropped out in the 10th grade to work, washing dishes 12 hours a day in a Chinese restaurant in Chinatown, cleaning hotel rooms in the Loop, waitressing in a bar in Wicker Park, anywhere that would hire someone underage and not ask too many questions, all to raise a child the American healthcare system had all but abandoned because they had no insurance, and that she had taught herself everything she knew about autism from books in the Harold Washington Public Library downtown, from YouTube videos watched on free Wi-Fi at McDonald's, from trial and error, and then trial again thousands of times in the darkness of cheap, rented rooms where no one ever came to help. Ash listened without interrupting, and every detail she gave him cut into the thing he had built around himself for 5 years. The illusion that money solved everything, that hiring the best people was enough, that he had done all he could for Ruby, because sitting across from him was a woman who had had nothing, no money, no degrees, no support system, nothing but her hands and her heart, and she had raised a child with severe autism for 12 years, with the one thing he, with his hundreds of millions of dollars, had never truly given Ruby: presence. Then June said the sentence Ash would never forget, the one that would follow him into sleep that night and into many nights after, and she said it in a soft voice, but every word landed as clearly as a blade carving into stone. "Your daughter doesn't need to be fixed, Ash. She needs to be understood." Ash opened his mouth by reflex, because he was a man who always had an answer, always had a rebuttal, always had a way to turn any conversation where he wanted it to go, but this time, nothing came out. Not one word, because that sentence had just exposed exactly what he had been doing for 5 years without realizing it. He had been trying to fix Ruby the way he fixed a business problem, throwing specialists at it, throwing money at it, throwing therapy and medication and schedules at it, trying to make her into something more normal, easier to manage, less painful for him to look at, while never once stopping long enough to understand that Ruby wasn't broken. Ruby was simply different. And that difference didn't need fixing. It needed to be seen. Silence stretched between them, and June didn't rush to fill it. She left it there, gave him time, in the same way she had given Ruby time on the restaurant floor that Saturday night. Then Ash asked, his voice lower now, less commanding, almost uncertain, "Your sister? Where is she now?" And June's face changed. Not much, only enough for Ash to see it, because he read people better than almost anyone, and what he read in her expression in that moment made him wish he hadn't asked. Pain. Not the loud kind that screams, but the kind that has settled so deep it has become part of the body, part of the breathing, part of the way a person looks at the world, the kind of pain money can't heal and time can't erase, only carry. June stood, pushed her chair back in gently, and said, "That's a long story, and I don't have the courage for it right now." Then she turned back to serve the guests who had just sat down by the window, as if the conversation they had just had were nothing more than a brief pause between two orders. And Ash remained there alone with his espresso gone completely cold, and he understood that the answer she hadn't given weighed more than everything she had said, and that her sister wasn't anywhere at all anymore, and that the pain on her face when he asked was the pain of someone who had lost, not someone merely separated. And he wanted the rest of that story more than he had ever wanted any secret torn from an enemy, but this time he couldn't order it, couldn't buy it, couldn't threaten it out of her. He could only wait until she was ready. And Ash Verano, once again, was learning how to wait from a night shift waitress, and what he still didn't know was that when she was finally ready to tell it, that story would not only break him, it would tie her past to his own family in a way neither of them could possibly imagine. Ash came back to Nero's the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. This time not alone but with Ruby in Knox's arms stepping in behind him. And what began as a return visit quickly became a habit. 4 times, 5 times a week, for 2 straight weeks, until the VIP table in the far corner of Nero's became the strangest thing the finest restaurant in Chicago had ever witnessed. The most powerful mafia boss in the city, his 5-year-old autistic daughter, and a night shift waitress, making $15 an hour plus tips, sitting together as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. Knox stood watch from the outside as always, but his eyes had grown less guarded when they rested on June, replaced instead by something closer to curiosity, even respect, though he would never have admitted that out loud. Felicity Tran stood behind the bar observing everything with eyes that narrowed more by the day, taking note of how long June left her guests' tables to sit with Ruby, taking note of how many times Ash watched June when she walked away to serve other diners, taking note of everything, and filing it away somewhere in her mind for the day she might need it. But what truly surprised Ash wasn't that Ruby was willing to come to the restaurant. It was what June prepared for her each time she came. Because every evening when Ruby sat down, there was already something waiting there for her. Not expensive toys, not an iPad or electronic devices the specialists had recommended, but small things, cheap things, things almost worthless to the eyes of people used to spending money. A box of 12 crayons bought at a dollar store, a tiny bottle of soap bubbles no bigger than a thumb, a smooth pebble June had picked up at the edge of Lake Michigan early that morning before her shift, a square piece of soft velvet cut to fit perfectly into Ruby's palm, so she could stroke it when she needed the comfort of a texture that felt safe. And every item was chosen not by chance but because June understood exactly what Ruby needed, understood that crayons gave her a way to communicate without words, understood that soap bubbles gave her sensitive eyes, something beautiful and gentle to follow, instead of the harsh restaurant lights, understood that the smooth stone and the velvet gave her hands, hands that always needed to hold tightly to something, a way to feel anchored to the world. And Ruby responded to those things in a way she had never responded to any of the therapy toys Ash had once bought for hundreds of dollars. She sat more quietly, breathed more slowly, her eyes grew brighter, and she began to draw, first scribbles, then shapes, circles, squares, and then people. And June praised every line in a soft, patient voice that was never too much, never loud, never anything that made Ruby fold inward. Ash sat across from them with a glass of wine in front of him that he never touched, and he watched, simply watched, and every day he watched, he realized a little more, one more small piece of the picture he had been blind to for 5 years. He had bought Ruby a room of her own 3 times the size of June's studio, with motion sensor lights and a soundproofing system worth $50,000. But he had never noticed that Ruby liked holding a pebble more than an iPad. He had hired an art therapist to come to the penthouse 3 times a week, with professional supplies imported from Germany. But he had never once sat down beside his daughter and asked what she was drawing. He had given Ruby everything money could buy, and yet had never given her the one thing June gave her, every evening, with a $1 box of crayons, and limitless patience, understanding. And then came the Thursday night of the second week, the night Ash would remember for the rest of his life. Ruby was drawing with crayons on the paper June had already placed in front of her, and the little girl stopped, looked up at June sitting beside her, and her eyes traveled down June's arm, to her wrist, to the scar. The long scar Ruby had touched on that first night, and Ruby reached out a finger and touched the scar again, gently, then said a single word, the first word she had spoken to June since that first night on the restaurant floor. Pretty. Ruby said it in a small, clear voice, certain and steady, as if she had thought about it for a long time before deciding to say it. And she didn't mean the scar was beautiful the way adults mean beauty. She meant it was beautiful because it was different, because it was special, because it didn't look like anything on anyone else's hand, just as Ruby didn't look or move or live like any other child. And in the world of a 5-year-old autistic child, where everything was too much, too loud, too bright, too frightening, something different that didn't threaten her was the most beautiful thing that could exist. June went still. Her hand, still holding a crayon, stopped in midair, and she didn't move, didn't breathe, because that word, pretty, from a 5-year-old child pointing to the 11-year-old scar on her wrist, had just pulled her backward into that rented room on the south side where Paige lay beside her every night. And before falling asleep, Paige always searched for that scar on her sister's hand, touched it, traced her finger along its line, and only then closed her eyes, every night for years, as if that scar were the map that led her into sleep. And no one had touched that scar since the last night Paige was still breathing. 2 years, 2 full years of June carrying that scar through every day with no one seeing it, no one asking about it, until this 5-year-old child reached for it and called it pretty, and tears spilled from June before she could stop them. She turned her face away, but not in time. Ruby saw, and the little girl didn't flinch, didn't shrink back. She only tilted her head and looked at June crying with a curious, warm expression, as if tears too were something normal, something allowed, something safe. Ash sat across from them and witnessed all of it. The word from Ruby's mouth, the tears on June's face, the look in his daughter's eyes as she gazed at the waitress, and something inside his chest cracked, not loudly, not with sharp pain, but with the quiet sound of ice splitting, the layer of ice he had built around himself from the night Leah died. 5 years of frozen armor, no psychologist, no associate, no one he had ever met had been able to touch. But tonight, a night shift waitress was crying because his daughter had touched her scar and called it beautiful. And that ice cracked, not shattered, not yet, but cracked. And Ash knew that if he kept sitting here, kept watching June with Ruby, kept letting something in her touch, something in him, then that ice would break completely. And he didn't know whether he would survive it when it did, but he also knew he wouldn't stop coming back. Not because he wanted to, but because for the first time in 5 years his daughter was talking to a stranger, smiling at a stranger, living in a way he had never seen her live before, and he wouldn't take that from Ruby even if it broke him from the inside out. And what he still didn't know was that the ice had only just begun to crack. Because what June was about to teach him in the weeks ahead wouldn't only change the way he saw his daughter, it would change the man he himself was in a way power, money, and even blood never had. The next night, when Ruby was sitting quietly drawing with crayons and June was putting the little bottle of soap bubbles back into her apron pocket, Ash said 2 words he hadn't said to anyone in the 15 years he had stood at the top of Chicago's underworld. Teach me. His voice still carried the sound of command, still the voice of a man used to giving orders and being obeyed without question, but his eyes did not. His eyes, for the first time, were not the eyes of the boss, not the eyes of a man in control, but the eyes of a father standing before a door he did not know how to open. And June saw that, saw the distance between his voice and his eyes, and she understood that for a man like him, those 2 words were everything he could give, the only way he knew how to say "I need help," without actually saying "I need help." June didn't nod right away. She looked at him for a long moment, then said in a voice that left no room for negotiation, the voice she had used to survive 12 years of raising her sister alone. No bodyguards in the room. No phone. Just you and Ruby. If you can't do that, don't start. And that sentence struck straight at everything Ash used to keep distance between himself and the world. Bodyguards were his shield. His phone was the cord that tied him to his empire. Those two things stayed with him everywhere, even in sleep. And June was asking him to set both of them down, not in a negotiation room with an enemy, but in front of his own 5-year-old daughter. And that request sounded simple, yet to Ash Verano it felt like being asked to take off his armor in the middle of a battlefield. He nodded, said nothing more. And from that day on, everything changed. June taught Ash, not in a classroom, not through books or slides the way the $500 an hour specialists had, but right there at the VIP table in Nero's, right on the restaurant floor, right inside the real moments with Ruby, by showing him what he had missed for 5 years because he had been too busy looking away. She taught him how to read Ruby's body before a meltdown arrived, the small signs he had never noticed, the way Ruby's shoulders began to tighten 5 minutes before she screamed, the way her fingers gripped the stuffed rabbit harder than usual when the noise became too much, the way her eyes closed and closed again, as if she were trying to shut out the outside world and couldn't. And June told him that if he learned to see those signs early, he could stop the storm before it made landfall instead of standing in the wreckage after it had already passed. She taught him how to speak to Ruby, not in the clipped, commanding tone he used with everyone else, but slower, lower, with fewer words, because Ruby's brain processed language differently. Every long sentence was a waterfall of information crashing over her, and all she wanted to do was hide. But one word, 2 words, spoken slowly, spoken low, Ruby could hear, Ruby could process, Ruby could stay. She taught him about the weighted blanket, the heavy blanket that, when laid over Ruby's body, gave her the feeling of even pressure, like being held without anyone actually touching her, because Ruby couldn't tolerate being hugged but still needed the feeling of being contained. And she taught him to lower the lights in Ruby's room, make them warmer, replace the white lights with soft yellow ones, because white light to Ruby felt like staring straight into the sun. And she taught him the tapping rhythm, the rhythm she had used that first night on Nero's floor, like a heartbeat, slow, steady, tapped against any surface when Ruby began losing control, not to pull her back, but to give her something to hold on to in the middle of chaos. During those 2 weeks, Ash came to Nero's every day, no longer as a VIP guest, but as a student. And that transformation was so strange that even Knox standing outside the door could feel it. His boss, the man who never bowed his head to anyone, was sitting there listening to a night shift waitress explain how to speak to his own daughter, and Knox didn't know whether he should be worried or grateful. Then came that afternoon, the Wednesday of the 2nd week, in the private room behind Nero's that Ash had asked to be cleared out, so Ruby would have a quiet space. No bodyguards, no phone, exactly as June had demanded. Ash did something he had never done in 5 years. He sat down on the floor right beside Ruby, said nothing, did nothing, just sat there, his $4,000 3-piece suit on the cold floor, his Patek Philippe turned face down on his wrist so the glass wouldn't reflect light into Ruby's eyes, and he sat still, breathing slowly, eyes lowered to his hands, exactly as June had taught him. Don't look straight into your daughter's eyes. Don't speak first. Don't touch first. Just be there. Let her know you are there, and wait. Ruby was drawing on the floor about 2 feet away from him, and she looked up at Ash, and this was the first time she had truly looked at her father without shrinking back, without turning away, without covering her ears. She looked with those dark brown eyes exactly like Leah's. Looked for a long time, a very long time, and Ash endured that gaze, even though it burned him from the inside out, because every time he looked into Ruby's eyes, he was looking into Leah's eyes, and for 5 years he had run from that gaze, but today he didn't run. He sat still and let his daughter look at him for as long as she needed. Then Ruby set down her crayon, moved slowly, very slowly, little by little, until she was beside Ash, and rested her head against his arm. That was all. No hug, no words, just that small head leaning against his arm, light as a feather. But Ash went still as if someone had pulled all the air from his lungs, every muscle in his body locked, not from fear, but because he understood that this was the moment he had unknowingly taken from his daughter for 5 years by never sitting low enough, never staying silent long enough, never being close enough, and tears ran down his face, down his cheekbones, down to his chin, onto the fabric of his suit. And he didn't wipe them away. not because he didn't want to, but because wiping them meant moving. And moving meant Ruby might pull away, and he would rather die than let that happen. So he sat there motionless, tears falling freely, 5 years of guilt breaking open in silence, 5 years of running from his daughter, because he couldn't bear to see Leah in her eyes, 5 years of throwing money and specialists into a space that might have needed nothing more than for him to sit on the floor and stay there. All of it breaking at once on the cold floor behind his own restaurant. And Ruby didn't know her father was crying. She only rested her head against the warmth of his arm and closed her eyes, peaceful, for the first time peaceful beside her father. Outside the half-closed door, Knox Draper stood still, his eyes watching through the narrow crack, and he saw the boss, the man he had followed for 15 years through gunfire and blood and the longest nights, sitting on the floor crying while his daughter rested her head against his arm. And Knox turned away, stepped back outside, and said nothing to anyone. Because there are some things, even the most loyal right hand knows he has no right to witness, and what neither Ash nor Knox knew in that moment was that this story had only just begun, because the woman who had taught Ash how to sit on the floor with his daughter was carrying inside her a grief and a secret that, once told, would tie her past to the Verano family by a bloodline no one could see until it was already too late. That night Ash didn't go home. He stood outside the back door of Nero's at 11:45, his back against the brick wall in the dark alley. No Knox, no bodyguards, no Maybach, just him alone in a black coat, with the October wind off Lake Michigan cutting through Chicago. And he waited, because after that afternoon on the floor with Ruby, after the tears he hadn't wiped away, after his daughter's head had rested against his arm as lightly as a feather, he knew he needed to talk to June, not about Ruby, not about techniques or therapy, but about the rest of the story she had closed off the day before when he asked where her sister was, the part she had said she didn't yet have the courage to tell. And Ash wasn't a patient man, but he had learned that over the past 2 weeks, from her, so he waited. The back door opened at 5 minutes to 12. June stepped out, apron off, hair tied back but with a few loose strands fallen across her forehead, shoulders slightly slumped with exhaustion after an 8-hour shift, an old purse slung across her body, and she stopped when she saw him. Not startled, not afraid, just stopped and looked, as if she had known he would be there, or as if she had grown used to facing unexpected things without ever being allowed the luxury of fear. He didn't say anything, only tilted his head toward the river, and June gave a small nod, and they walked. The two of them, a Mafia boss and a night shift waitress, side by side along the empty sidewalks of the West Loop, at midnight, not speaking, only walking, until they stopped at an iron bench beside the Chicago River, under the dull yellow light of a street lamp, the wind brushing the water into small ripples, the cold scent of the river mixing with the metallic smell of the city. And June sat down, holding her purse on her lap. And Ash sat beside her, keeping just enough distance not to invade, but close enough to hear, because he had learned that distance mattered. Silence stretched for a while, not uncomfortable. Only two people trying to find a way into a conversation they both knew would hurt. Then June said, without looking at him, her eyes on the river, her name was Paige. And Ash heard the past tense in that one word, was, and everything he had suspected since the day before when her face changed at the question of where her sister was. Everything was confirmed in that single word, and he said nothing, only let her tell it in her own rhythm, because that was what she had taught him. Don't push, don't rush, just stay there. June told him Paige had severe autism, far more severe than Ruby's, that she almost never spoke, almost never communicated, and on top of that she had epilepsy, seizures that could come at any time, in the middle of the night, in the middle of a meal, in the middle of the street, and every seizure felt like one more time June thought she was going to lose her. She told him about Hope Bridge Clinic, a tiny community clinic on the South Side, the only place in all of Chicago that took uninsured patients, the only place where Paige could have a doctor monitor her seizures, adjust her medication, check on her regularly, the place June took Paige twice a month by riding 3 different buses because she couldn't afford a taxi. And that clinic hadn't just been medical care, it had been the only lifeline keeping Paige alive, keeping June upright, keeping the two sisters from sinking. Then 5 years earlier, on a Monday morning, June brought Paige to the clinic for a scheduled appointment and found the doors locked, the sign taken down, a piece of paper taped to the glass that read, "Permanently closed," and offered no explanation, no warning, No instructions about transferring patients, open the day before, locked the next, as if the 200 children being treated there had never existed. And June stood in front of that locked door, holding Paige's hand, with no idea where to go next. She tried to find another clinic, called dozens of places, but no one would take an uninsured patient. No one would take a case of severe autism combined with epilepsy without a referral from a specialist she couldn't afford to see. And the American healthcare system was a maze that people with money could move through easily, while people without money just kept smashing into walls until they gave up or collapsed. And June didn't give up, but she didn't win either. She bought generic medication from the pharmacy, using the dosage she remembered from Paige's last appointment. But no one adjusted it when the seizures changed. No one checked when the medication stopped being enough, and Paige declined. The seizures came more often, harder, longer, and June knew it was happening, but she had no way to stop it with $15 an hour and courage alone. Then she stopped, drew in a long breath, and told the part Ash knew was coming but still wasn't ready to hear. 2 years earlier, on a cold March night, in a basement studio in Pilsen, June slept on the bed against the wall. Paige slept on the bed 10 feet away. 10 feet. Not far, not close. Only enough space for both beds to fit inside the 120-square-foot room, and in the middle of the night Paige had a seizure. But this time there was no scream, no sound of falling. The seizure came in silence the way it sometimes did, and June didn't hear it, didn't wake up, didn't know. She was sleeping too hard after a 12-hour shift, and her body had reached its limit. And the next morning when she turned to wake Paige, her sister was cold. Her skin had changed color. Her eyes were half open and staring at the ceiling, and June understood in that instant that Paige had died during the night, alone, 10 feet from her sister, and her sister hadn't known. 10 feet, Ash. June said it without a trembling voice, without crying, in a flat tone so terrifying it was worse than sobbing, but her hands were gripping the strap of her purse on her lap so hard her knuckles had gone white, clenched tightly enough that Ash could see the blue veins rising on the back of her hand. I was 10 feet away and I couldn't save her. Silence. The river wind moved past them. The streetlight flickered once, then steadied, and June went on, still not looking at Ash, her eyes still on the water. That's why I didn't take your money. Every minute I spend with Ruby is every minute I wasn't there for Paige in time. Your daughter isn't a job to me, Ash. She's everything I couldn't do for my sister. And Ash sat there in silence, not because he had nothing to say, but because any word he could offer in that moment would have been too small, too hollow, too useless against 10 feet, against a locked clinic door, against waking up to find your sister already cold. And he looked down at June's hand, the hand with the scar, the hand Ruby had touched, the hand Paige used to trace every night before falling asleep. And under the dull yellow streetlight beside the Chicago River at midnight in October, Ash Verano wanted for the first time in his life to know someone not for a purpose, not because he needed information, not because he was assessing a threat, but because he cared, simply that. He cared about the girl sitting beside him and the pain she carried, and that feeling was so unfamiliar. It was almost frightening to a man who had spent 37 years living by never caring about anyone beyond himself and his empire. And he still didn't know that the pain June had just described, the clinic that had closed, the sister she had lost, the 10 feet, all of it was tied by an invisible thread that led straight back to the Verano family, to his father, to the very name he carried. And when that thread was finally dragged into the light, it wouldn't only break the trust June was slowly beginning to place in him. It would shatter everything he thought he knew about his wife's death. While Ash was learning how to become the father Ruby needed, and while something between him and June was taking shape slowly, quietly, like roots growing in the dark, there was one person who had watched everything from the beginning and was waiting for the right moment to strike. Felicity Tran wasn't stupid. She had managed Nero's for 4 years, and she had survived in that position not because she was good at running a restaurant, but because she was good at reading power. She had known who Nero's belonged to from her first week on the job, knew that the VIP tables in the back weren't just seats but territory, knew that the bodyguards standing near the bar weren't there to protect customers but to protect the true owner. And she had spent 4 years carefully keeping herself just close enough to be trusted, just far enough away not to be seen as a threat. All of it to build her place within Ash Verano's orbit. Because being near Ash Verano meant being near power, and Felicity understood power better than anything else. But over the past 4 weeks, She had watched everything she had carefully built, being accidentally torn apart by a night shift waitress without the girl even trying. June Peretti, the girl Felicity hadn't even bothered to remember by name before that Saturday night, and who now sat at Ash's table every evening, who now got a nod from Knox when she walked past, who now received the one thing Felicity had wanted for 4 years and never gotten, Ash Verano's real attention. Not the polite attention a boss gave a manager, but the kind of attention a man gave a woman who was changing him. And Felicity saw that more clearly than anyone because she had spent 4 years watching Ash and had never once seen him look at anyone the way he looked at June. And Felicity decided that if she couldn't have that attention, then she would make sure June couldn't have it either. The call came at 9 o'clock on Tuesday morning, through the restaurant's private line, the one Felicity had access to as manager, the number only people inside the trusted circle had, and Felicity knew exactly what she was doing when she dialed it. Ash answered, and Felicity spoke in the voice of someone sincerely concerned, the kind of voice she had perfected after 4 years of performance, and she said that June had repeatedly asked coworkers to cover her tables so she could spend time with Ash's family, that June was neglecting her job more and more, that the other employees were starting to complain, and then Felicity lowered her voice, as if she didn't want to say this but had to because loyalty demanded it, and said she had seen June using her phone to take pictures of the VIP section a few times, that one coworker had overheard June asking about Ash's schedule, and that I don't want to accuse anyone, Mr. Verano, but in times like these, with the FBI increasing pressure on operations in the South Side, you can't be too careful about who you let close. FBI. Those 3 letters entered Ash's ear the way a bullet entered flesh, slow, hot, and already doing damage, because in the world Ash lived in, trust wasn't a luxury, it was life and death. The people he trusted lived, the people he didn't trust disappeared. That simple. And the FBI was the permanent nightmare of every underground organization, every boss, every operation, because the FBI didn't come with guns, they came with people, with informants, with insiders wearing friendly faces and harmless smiles, faces exactly like the face of the night shift waitress, who was slowly becoming impossible to live without in the life he shared with his daughter. Ash ended the call without saying thank you, without saying anything at all, and sat still in his office for a long time. His reason told him Felicity could be jealous, could be exaggerating, could be lying, but the survival instinct he had sharpened over 15 years in the underworld whispered, "Don't ignore it. Don't get careless. Don't let your heart lead, because a heart leading the way is the fastest route to death." And the seed of suspicion Felicity planted wasn't large, only tiny, but it was there now, inside the Mafia boss's mind, waiting for water so it could grow. The following night, Ash came to Nero's with Ruby as usual, but different. He sat at the VIP table with his shoulders tighter, his eyes colder, didn't look at June when she approached, didn't nod hello the way he had over the past few weeks, until it had become habit, only ordered an espresso in a clipped voice and lowered his gaze to his phone, scrolling through messages that didn't matter just to have an excuse not to look up, and the wall June had patiently dismantled brick by brick over 4 weeks suddenly rose again in a single night, taller, thicker, colder. June noticed at once, because she had spent her whole life standing outside other people's trust. She knew what sudden coldness looked like, what it felt like. She had seen it in the eyes of landlords when she asked for more time on rent, in the eyes of doctors when she asked about free assistance programs, in her mother's eyes right before she walked out the door and never came back. She knew that kind of coldness, and it was sitting across from her now in a gray 3-piece suit. But she said nothing, didn't ask right away, only set crayons and paper in front of Ruby the way she did every evening, and turned back to her other tables, giving Ash the space she knew he needed, even though she didn't know why. Ruby sat drawing, silent as always, but she could feel it. An autistic child felt the energy around her far more intensely than most people did. And Ruby knew something was wrong. Her shoulders began to tighten, her fingers gripped the crayon harder, and then she stopped drawing, looked at the picture she had just finished. 3 people, one tall, one medium, one small, standing beside one another, and around all 3 of them was a large heart drawn in red crayon, the scribbled uneven lines of a 5-year-old child, but unmistakable. And Ruby pushed the drawing gently across the table toward June, who had just returned, gently, carefully, as if she were pushing something precious. June looked at the drawing and her breath caught, because she recognized the 3 figures at once, one tall in a black suit, one medium wearing an apron, one small with a stuffed rabbit, and the red heart surrounding them all. And then Ruby spoke. Clearly, slowly, each word chosen carefully by a child for whom every word was a battle with the world. The first full phrase she had spoken in public in more than a year. June. Safe. Those two words crossed the table and hit Ash harder than any evidence, harder than any argument, because his daughter, the child who trusted no one, the child who shrank from strangers, the child for whom the outside world was an enemy, had just looked into the eyes of a night shift waitress and said she was safe. And his eyes left the phone, moved to Ruby, to the drawing, to June holding the paper in both hands with eyes gone wet as she fought to keep herself steady. And the seed of suspicion Felicity had planted, wavered, tilted, but still didn't fall, because Ash Verano had lived too long in a world where whatever looked the most beautiful was often the most likely to be a trap, and he couldn't shut that instinct off just because his daughter had spoken 2 words, even if those 2 words were tearing him in half. June looked at him, directly, and asked in a soft but straight voice, "Something happened?" And Ash answered with a single word, cutting through the air like a blade, "Nothing. Cold. Closed. Finished." And June nodded, didn't press, didn't ask again, didn't show how hurt she was, even though she was hurt. She only nodded and turned back to work, because she was used to being pushed out, used to standing outside the walls of other people, used to receiving no explanation, and she wasn't going to beg for anyone's trust, not even the Mafia boss she was beginning to care about more than she allowed herself to admit. And what neither Ash nor June knew was that Felicity's lie was only the first stone in the landslide, because what was about to be exposed about the Verano family's past would not be a mere seed of doubt, but a slow-burning bomb, powerful enough to destroy everything the two of them were building. The next morning, sitting in his office on the top floor of Verano Holdings, looking out at the Chicago skyline blurred by the early morning haze, Ash picked up the phone and called Knox. And when he spoke, his voice was the boss's voice, not the voice of the father who had cried on the restaurant floor the week before, not the voice of the man who had sat beside the waitress on a bench by the river at midnight, but the cold, sharp voice of a Mafia boss reactivating his survival instincts. Find out everything about June Peretti. Everything. Where she was born, where she went to school, who she talks to, where she sleeps, what she eats, how much she has in her bank account. Every single thing. Knox. Don't miss a detail. Knox was silent for 2 seconds on the other end of the line, and those 2 seconds said more than any question could have, because Knox wasn't a man who hesitated. In 15 years at Ash's side, he had carried out every order without blinking, but those 2 seconds were Knox weighing whether he should tell the boss that he was wrong, and then deciding not to, because Knox knew the line, and that line was never to question the boss's decision when the boss used that voice. So he only said, "Done," and hung up. 48 hours later, Knox walked into Ash's office without knocking, because between the two of them knocking wasn't necessary, and laid a thick brown folder on the desk, its top right corner bent, the kind of folder Knox used for every internal investigation, and Ash opened it. The first page held the basic information. June Marie Peretti, born in Chicago, 27 years old, and from there on each page was a chapter of a life. Ash read through the eyes of a man searching for a threat. Yet the more he read, the more he found something entirely different. Father, David Peretti, pediatrician, murdered when June was 9 years old. Chicago Police Department file stating, armed robbery, suspect never found. A cold case. No suspect, no leads, no one prosecuted, only a doctor dead on the sidewalk in front of his daughter and the city stepping over it, the way people step over a puddle. Mother, Teresa Peretti, née Gallo, walked out when June was 13, left no address, never called back, never returned, vanished from the lives of her 2 daughters, as if she had never existed. June dropped out in the 10th grade. Lincoln Park High School file stating, dropped out, family hardship. And after that came the long chain of jobs, dishwashing, housekeeping, bar work, restaurant shifts, no gaps, no breaks, not a single day without work for 14 years. Younger sister, Paige Renee Peretti, severe autism with epilepsy, died 2 years ago, death certificate stating sudden unexpected death in epilepsy. No autopsy requested because the family did not ask for one, because at that time the family was one person, and that one person didn't have money to ask for anything. Ash turned the page. No criminal record, no arrests, not a single citation, not one parking ticket. Owed no one a cent, because no one lent money to people like her. Bank account at Chase. Balance $847. And Ash read that number twice because he spent more than that on a dinner, on a bottle of wine, on a tip he tossed onto a table without thinking. Current address. Basement studio on 18th Street in Pilsen. $650 a month. And Knox had attached photographs, because he was that thorough. One taken from outside, the stairs leading down to the basement worn thin, the paint on the door peeling, and another taken from inside through the basement window. The room small and cramped, the walls streaked with damp patches, and Ash looked at that photograph longer than any other page in the file, because that room was smaller than the guest bathroom in his penthouse, and the girl living there was the girl who had refused his $5,000 without blinking. Knox stood across the desk, silent, waiting for Ash to finish reading, then said in the driest voice possible, though every word had been chosen carefully, "She's cleaner than anyone I've ever looked into, boss. No connections, no debts, no affiliations, no red flags. If she's a threat, then I'm the Pope." And Ash knew Knox was telling the truth, because Knox never exaggerated, not once in 15 years. And if Knox said the girl was clean, then the girl was clean, and the seed of suspicion Felicity had planted began to wither in his mind. But then Knox said, "But there's one thing," and his voice changed, only slightly, enough for Ash to look up, and Knox pointed to a line in the file marked in red pen, the line listing June's father, David Peretti, pediatrician, and under last place of employment it said clearly, Hope Bridge Clinic, Southside Chicago. Ash read the line and stopped. Hope Bridge Clinic, the name June had spoken that night by the river, the clinic that had closed. Page's clinic, but that night the name had only drifted past because Ash had been too busy listening to the 10 feet, and the morning she woke up to find her sister already cold. But now the name sat there in black ink on white paper, in an investigative file, tied to June's father, and something moved inside Ash's mind, faint, distant, like the sound of a bell ringing at the end of a dark hallway, and he opened his laptop, accessed the internal property records system of the Verano family, the encrypted system only the boss had clearance to enter, and typed Hope Bridge into the search field. The result appeared in less than a second. One entry, land, Southside Chicago, purchased 5 years earlier, listed value suspiciously low, transferred through 3 shell companies before ending up in Verano Holdings, approval signed by Conrad Verano, intended use listed as commercial development, but current status marked vacant, undeveloped, meaning the land had been bought. The clinic had been erased, and no one had built anything on it. It had simply sat there, empty, like a grave without a marker. Ash stared at the screen and everything stopped. The sound of the city outside the glass disappeared. The faint shift of Knox's footsteps behind him disappeared. There was only the blue light of the screen on his face, and the name Conrad Verano, his father. His father had bought the land Hope Bridge Clinic stood on. His father had shut down the only clinic where Paige had been treated. And June's father, Dr. David Peretti, had worked at that same clinic before being killed in a robbery no one had ever solved, and those threads began tying themselves together in Ash's mind in a way he didn't want to believe yet couldn't deny, and he sat there motionless, staring at his father's name on the screen, and for the first time in his life, Ash Verano was afraid of what he was about to find. Not afraid of enemies, not afraid of the FBI, not afraid of bullets or knives or betrayal, but afraid of the truth, afraid that the thread connecting Hope Bridge to David Peretti to Conrad Verano would lead somewhere he never wanted to go. And what he still didn't know was that that thread didn't only lead to the clinic and to June's father. It led straight to the night Leah died, to the bullet he believed had come from a rival gang, to the truth his father had taken into the grave 3 years earlier, and that truth was about to be dragged back into the light by a phone call he never expected to receive. The phone rang at the exact moment Ash was staring at his father's name on the laptop screen, and he almost didn't hear it because his mind was somewhere else, lost inside the maze of threads connecting Hope Bridge Clinic to David Peretti to Conrad Verano. But then he glanced at the screen of his phone and stopped, because the number flashing there wasn't saved in his contacts. Yet the area code was familiar, a Florida area code, and something inside his gut tightened on instinct before reason had time to explain why. He answered, and the voice on the other end was one he hadn't heard in 5 years, the voice of Reed Colson, 60 years old, former chief accountant of the Verano family under Conrad's rule, the man who had vanished without a trace 5 years earlier. One day, still sitting at his desk on the third floor of Verano Holdings. The next day, his chair empty, his desk cleared, his apartment vacant, as if he had never existed at all, and Conrad at the time had only said, "Reed retired. Don't ask about it," in the tone everyone in the family knew meant, "Don't ask if you still wanted to keep breathing." So no one asked. Not even Ash. But now Reed was calling, and his voice wasn't the voice of a man who had retired, but the voice of a man exhausted, thin, dry, the voice of someone dying and fully aware of it. "Ash, it's Reed. Reed Colson." Silence. Then, "I know you have questions. I'm calling because I won't be alive long enough for you to find me and ask them." Reed said he was in Florida, in a hospice outside Tampa, terminal lung cancer. The doctors had given him 3 weeks, maybe less, and he had spent 5 years running, but couldn't carry what he knew into the grave. Not because of conscience. Reed said flatly that he didn't have much conscience, but because he had seen June Peretti's name in something his daughter sent him, an internal social media post from Nero's staff about the waitress who had helped the boss's daughter calm down. And that name, Peretti, had dragged Reed out of 5 years of silence because he knew that name, knew it very well. Ash sat down, not because he wanted to, but because his legs weakened beneath him, and Reed began to tell it from the beginning, in the even voice of a man who had rehearsed this story in his head for 5 years, while waiting for the day he would finally speak it aloud. 18 years earlier, Conrad Verano had set his sights on a piece of land on the south side, a strategic location near the port, in an area where the police rarely patrolled, perfect for the underground casino. Conrad wanted to build to expand the family's income, but on that land stood Hope Bridge Clinic, a small nonprofit community clinic specializing in treating disabled and autistic children from low-income families, a place where more than 200 children were being monitored and cared for. And the head doctor, the founder, the soul of the clinic, was David Peretti, a pediatrician, a man Reed described as the only truly good man I ever met in this business, and he wasn't even in this business. Conrad offered to buy the land, and he offered high, 3 times market value, the kind of money anyone else would have taken without a second thought. But David Peretti wasn't anyone else. He looked Conrad in the eye and said, "There are 200 children who need me here. No amount of money is enough," and refused, firmly, with no room for negotiation. And Reed said he had been in the room when that meeting happened. He had seen Conrad's face when he was refused. And in that instant, he knew David Peretti had just signed his own death warrant, because Conrad Verano wasn't the kind of man who got refused and walked away. Conrad was the kind of man who got refused and made sure the person who refused him never got the chance to refuse anyone again. 3 weeks later, David Peretti was shot dead on the sidewalk outside his home. In the evening, while walking back from the clinic, 2 shots, chest and head, professional, clean, and the police report listed it as armed robbery gone wrong, wallet and watch taken, suspect not found. Because Conrad had paid the right people in the police department to make sure the case died before it ever breathed. And June, 9 years old, had been standing at the second-floor window, waiting for her father to come home for dinner. And she saw everything. Saw her father fall, saw the shadow of the man running, saw the blood on the sidewalk beneath the streetlight, and Ash had known that part already from Knox's file. But hearing Reed tell it made it different, made it heavier, because now he knew the shadow running that night had been running on his father's orders. Reed kept going. After David's death, Conrad assumed the clinic would close, but it didn't. The remaining doctors and nurses struggled to keep it alive. The community donated, volunteers came in, and Hope Bridge survived another 13 years without its founder. 13 years Conrad waited, because he was busy building the rest of his empire, and that piece of land wasn't yet his top priority. Until 5 years ago, when Conrad decided to finish it. This time he didn't need to kill anyone, because David Peretti was no longer there to refuse him. This time Conrad used a different method, bribing a federal health inspector to launch a surprise inspection, fabricating a long list of sanitation and safety violations that had never existed, pressuring the clinic's board with threats of criminal prosecution, and finally forcing the clinic to shut down within 48 hours, with no notice to patients, no transfer of records, 200 children and their families arriving at the doors on Tuesday morning to find a sign that read, permanently closed, and no idea where to go. Among them, June and Paige. Reed was the one who handled the financial paperwork, moved the land through 3 shell companies, erased the trail, made sure the Verano name never appeared on a single public document. And when it was done, Reed looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the man looking back. So he ran from Chicago, from the family, from Conrad, ran all the way to Florida and disappeared, because he knew that if he stayed, once Conrad no longer needed him, he would be next. I ran because I knew if I stayed, I'd end up like David Peretti, Reed said, his voice tired, nearly out of breath. And now I'm dying anyway, so it doesn't matter anymore. Ash sat motionless, the phone pressed to his ear, his eyes fixed on the glass wall without seeing the city beyond it, only seeing the ghost of his father, Conrad Verano, the man he had idolized through his teenage years, the man who had taught him how to hold a gun, how to read people, how to run an empire, the man Ash had wept for when they lowered him into the ground 3 years earlier. That man had ordered the murder of June's father, had destroyed the only clinic where Paige had been treated, had indirectly pushed Paige toward death and June into 14 years of hell, and Ash felt the floor beneath him turn soft, as if the foundation of everything he thought he knew about his family was dissolving under his feet. But Reed still wasn't finished. There's more, Ash. About Leah. And those 2 words, about Leah, hit Ash like a steel fist in the center of his chest, because Leah was the wound he had stitched shut with ice and cruelty for 5 years, and anyone who touched that wound was touching the most dangerous thing inside the Mafia boss, and what Reed was about to say next wouldn't just tear the stitches open. It would rip apart everything Ash believed was true about the night his wife died. Reed drew in a slow breath on the other end of the line, heavy and ragged, the breath of lungs being eaten away by cancer day after day. And then he said, Leah found the files. Ash. She found everything. And Ash, the man no one in Chicago's underworld dared speak his late wife's name in front of because everyone knew that was forbidden ground, stood frozen as if someone had drained all the blood from his body, because Reed had just said Leah's name, and Reed had just said files. And those 2 things standing side by side in the same sentence could not possibly lead anywhere good. Reed said that 5 years earlier, during the exact week Hope Bridge Clinic was shut down, Leah had been in Conrad's private office at the family's main estate in Lake Forest. She had gone there to get Ruby's birth certificate from the safe, because she needed to submit it to the hospital to register Ruby for a developmental monitoring program. And Conrad wasn't home. He was downtown overseeing the clinic operation. And Leah opened the safe with the code Conrad had once shared because he trusted his daughter-in-law, trusted that Leah was only a sweet young wife taking care of her child, and would never ask dangerous questions. But Conrad had been wrong. Inside the safe, right beside Ruby's birth certificate, was a folder. A brown folder exactly like the kind Knox used. And Leah opened it. Maybe out of curiosity. Maybe out of instinct. Maybe because she had long suspected her husband's family did more than real estate. And inside was everything. The Hope Bridge land purchase records, the transfer documents moving the property through shell companies, the payment records for the health inspector, and worst of all, at the bottom, a handwritten note in Conrad's own handwriting, short and cold, listing David Peretti's name, the date, and 3 words, resolved, no trace. And Leah was smart. She put the pieces together. The murdered doctor, the clinic shut down, the land stolen, all of it done by her father-in-law. And Reed knew because Leah had called him. Called because she didn't know who else to call. She couldn't call Ash because she was afraid Ash knew, afraid her husband was part of all of it. And she called Reed because Reed was the only person in the family she felt still had a shred of conscience. And she told Reed she was going to tell Ash everything, that she would not live inside a family where her father-in-law murdered people and stole land from disabled children. And Reed begged her not to say anything, begged because he knew what Conrad would do. But Leah didn't listen. Leah said, I won't let my daughter grow up in a family built on murdered children's futures, and hung up. Reed called Conrad immediately after, not out of loyalty but out of fear. Fear that if Conrad discovered Reed knew, Leah knew, and had said nothing, he would die with her. And Conrad listened without saying a word, only stayed silent for 5 seconds, then hung up. And Reed said those 5 seconds of silence were the moment Conrad decided to kill his daughter-in-law. 3 days later, Leah died. Ash remembered that night, remembered every second, remembered the call at 11 o'clock from Knox, saying there had been a shooting in near North Side. Leah had been hit. He remembered driving to Northwestern Memorial Hospital at 100 miles an hour. Remembered the white hallway, the smell of antiseptic, the doctor saying, "I'm sorry, Mr. Verano. We did everything we could." Remembered seeing his wife lying on the hospital bed, eyes closed, skin pale, 2 gunshot wounds, one in the chest and one in the shoulder. And the police said it had been gang crossfire, wrong place, wrong time, an accident, bad luck. And Ash had believed it for 5 years, had suffered for 5 years, had been angry at the world for 5 years, had become more ruthless, more cold, more distant from his daughter for 5 years because of the pain of losing his wife, never once knowing there had been no gang crossfire at all, no bad luck, no accident, only his father ordering his wife killed because she knew too much. "It wasn't a crossfire, Ash," Reed said, almost whispering. "Conrad ordered it. He had 2 of his men stage the shooting. Leah was the target. She was always the target." And then the line went silent because Ash didn't speak, didn't breathe, didn't move. He stood in the office on the top floor of the building, bearing his family's name, and the world he knew was collapsing in great pieces all around him. His father killed his wife. His father killed June's father. His father destroyed the clinic Paige needed to stay alive. And the chain of choices made by one man who had been dead for 3 years was still killing people even now. Killing Paige 2 years earlier in that basement studio, 10 feet away from her sister. Killing June's childhood. Killing Ash's ability to love. Killing the first 5 years of Ruby's life that should have been lived with her mother. The phone slipped from Ash's hand and hit the carpet, and he heard Reed speaking from far away, faint and blurred. "I'm sorry, Ash. I should have told you sooner. I was a coward." But Ash wasn't really hearing anymore. He was staring down at his own hands, hands carrying the same blood as Conrad, hands that had gone on building the empire on the very foundation his father had built with blood. And he thought of June, the girl who had knelt on the floor of his restaurant and saved his daughter with the heart his family had tried to crush. The girl who had taught him how to be a father while his own family had stolen hers. The girl who had given Ruby the love Ruby should have received from Leah. The mother his own father had murdered. And the brutal irony of all of it twisted together inside Ash's chest like barbed wire. Because the 2 of them, he and June, 2 sides of the city, 2 lives that should never have touched, had both been destroyed by exactly the same man without ever knowing it. And that man was his father. And Ash carried that man's name, that man's blood, that man's empire, and now he was standing in the ruins of a truth he wished he had never learned. But he had learned it, and he could never unknow it. And the only question left was not what he would do with this truth, but whether he had enough courage to tell June, the woman who was slowly beginning to trust him, slowly beginning to open her heart to him, slowly beginning to let him step into her world, that it was his family who had killed her father and destroyed everything she had ever had. And if he told her, he would lose her, lose the only person Ruby trusted. But if he didn't tell her, then every time she looked at him with those trusting eyes, he would be betraying her one more time. And Ash Verano, the man who had never feared any decision in his life, for the first time didn't know what to choose. While Ash was drowning in the truth, Reed had just poured over his head. While he was wrestling with the question of whether to tell June or stay silent, Felicity Tran was doing what she did best, digging. The false FBI call hadn't brought the results she wanted because Ash still came to Nero's, still brought Ruby, still looked at June with the kind of gaze Felicity had always wanted turned on herself. And that failure didn't make Felicity stop. It made her escalate, because Felicity was the kind of person who, when the first blow missed, didn't retreat, but hit harder. She began investigating June on her own, not through Knox's system, not through the underground network, but in the oldest and most effective way possible, asking questions, listening, searching through scraps. She spoke with former employees who had worked with June at other restaurants, asked about her family, about her past, and she found an old GoFundMe post June had created 3 years earlier to raise money for Paige's treatment, a fundraiser that had brought in only $217 before June deleted it out of shame. And on that page there had been mention of Hope Bridge Clinic and the name David Peretti, and Felicity Googled that name, found a tiny archived article from the Chicago Tribune 18 years earlier about a pediatrician shot to death in a robbery, the founder of the Hope Bridge Community Clinic. And then Felicity kept digging, found the record of the clinic's closure 5 years earlier on the Illinois Department of Public Health website, and found the name Verano Holdings listed as the current owner of the land on that property in the public real estate database of Cook County. And Felicity didn't know Conrad had ordered David killed, didn't know the details, didn't know about Leah, but she knew enough, knew that the Verano family owned the land where June's father's clinic had once stood, and that was enough to make the bomb she needed. This time, Felicity didn't call Ash. She had learned that hitting Ash directly didn't work because he was too good at controlling information. So she struck at June instead, at the weaker link, at the person with no bodyguards, no system, no power to protect herself. She bought a prepaid phone at Walgreens with cash and sent a text message to June's personal number, the number she had taken from the restaurant employee records. A short message, cold, precise, like a bullet. Ask Ash Verano about Hope Bridge Clinic and David Peretti. Ask what his family did to your father. June was on the bus, going home after her night shift, when her phone buzzed, and she read the message under the blue light of the screen on an almost empty midnight bus, and her hand shook. Not a slight tremor, but a hard shake. Hard enough that she had to lower the phone onto her lap because she was afraid she would drop it, because her father's name had just appeared beside Ash Verano's in the same sentence. Her father, David Peretti, the man murdered before her eyes when she was 9 years old, and Ash Verano, the man she was slowly beginning to trust, slowly beginning to open herself to, slowly beginning to let into the part of her no one had entered since Paige died. And those two names stood next to each other in an anonymous message. And June didn't know who had sent it, didn't know whether it was true, but she knew she couldn't not ask, couldn't sleep tonight without knowing the answer. Because if this was true, then everything she thought she knew about Ash Verano was a lie. And if it was a lie, then someone was trying to destroy the only good thing she had in her miserable life. The next night June came to Nero's, but it wasn't her shift, and she wasn't wearing her uniform. She had on her old coat and jeans, her hair loose, dark circles under her eyes from not sleeping, and she walked straight through the empty restaurant after closing time, where only Ash remained at the VIP table going over paperwork and Knox stood by the bar. And she went directly to Ash's table, didn't stop, didn't greet him, laid her phone on the wooden tabletop with the screen facing up, the anonymous message glowing clearly, and said in a voice Ash had never heard from her before, a voice not calm, not gentle, not patient, but the voice of someone standing at the edge of a cliff and needing to know whether she was about to fall or be pulled back. Tell me this isn't true. Ash looked at the phone screen, read the message, and everything he had been struggling with for the last 48 hours, since Reed's call came crashing into this one moment, because he hadn't decided, hadn't prepared, hadn't figured out how to say it, and now June was standing in front of him demanding an answer right now. And he went silent. Not the strategic silence he used in negotiations, but the silence of a man for whom there were no words in the world big enough to say what needed saying without destroying everything. And that silence stretched 1 second, 2 seconds, 5 seconds, 10 seconds. And each second became an answer, because if it weren't true, he would have denied it immediately. If it had nothing to do with him, he would have spoken right away. But he stayed silent, and June read that silence more clearly than any words. She took 1 step back, only 1 step. But that step was farther than any distance there had ever been between them before. And her eyes didn't fill with tears, which was worse than tears. Her eyes went dark. The light Ash had seen when she looked at Ruby. The light when she spoke of Paige. The light when she sat across from him and said, "Understood, not fixed." All of it went out, and she said in a flat voice, "My father, the clinic, my sister. All because of your family?" Ash opened his mouth. "June, I didn't know. I just found out. I swear I didn't." And she cut him off, not shouting, not screaming, just speaking in a calm voice, more terrifying than any scream could have been. "You're a mafia boss, Ash. You run this city, but you didn't know your own father murdered people?" And that cut into Ash because it was true. True in the way truth always is, when it hurts the most. He was the boss. He controlled everything. He knew everything. But he hadn't known this, or he hadn't wanted to know, or he had looked away for too long and now he was paying for it. Knox, from where he stood by the bar, moved toward the exit on 15 years of instinct, because in their world no one left when the boss hadn't allowed it. No one walked out carrying information about the family without being controlled. But Ash saw Knox move and raised his hand, fast, decisive, and shook his head once, a small motion but enough to stop Knox in the middle of his step, because Ash was choosing, in this exact moment, between the Mafia instinct that said no one walked out of the room, carrying family secrets, and the part of his humanity June had awakened over the past 5 weeks that said she was not a prisoner, not a threat. She was the woman his family had taken everything from, and she had the right to walk away if she wanted to. Knox stopped. June walked straight out the door. Didn't look back. Didn't turn around. Her steps steady but her back rigid. The way people walk when they are trying not to collapse in the middle of the street, and the door of Nero's shut behind her, the sound echoing through the empty restaurant like a gunshot. And Ash stood alone among the empty tables, cold wine in his glass, candles already dead, the empire his father had built with blood surrounding him like the walls of a prison. And Knox looked at his boss from the bar in silence, without asking, without advising, because Knox knew that in a moment like this, no advice would be enough. And the only thing Knox knew for certain was that the girl who had just walked out that door would not come back. And if she didn't come back, Ruby would break. And if Ruby broke, Ash would break. And if Ash broke, the whole empire would break with him. And all of it had begun with an anonymous text message, whose source Knox would trace far sooner than Felicity Tran imagined. On the first day without June, Ruby refused to come out of her room. Ash stood outside his daughter's door at 7 a.m, knocked softly, 2 taps, in the exact rhythm June had taught him, and waited, but there was no answer. Only the sound of the stuffed rabbit dragging across the floor, and the sound of Ruby rocking back and forth, steady, her body creating that repeated motion to make up for the fact that something in the outside world was missing. Something she had no words for, but her body knew. Her body felt June's absence more clearly than any language could ever describe. The new nanny Knox had called in got screamed out of the room before she could even step over the threshold. The familiar therapist called to offer advice from a distance, but Ash listened for 10 seconds and hung up because everything the therapist was saying was meaningless when his daughter wanted only one person, and that person had walked out of Nero's carrying shattered trust with her. On the second day, Ruby refused food, not eating less, not being selective the way she had on difficult days before, but refusing completely. The plate Knox set outside her door, still untouched when he came back for it, gone cold, and Ash began to feel fear in a way he never had before. Not fear of enemies or fear of death, but fear that his daughter was destroying herself and he could not stop it, because he had spent 5 years handing her off to other people whenever things became hard, and now that he wanted to be there, he didn't know how, or he knew but he wasn't enough, because he wasn't June. He didn't have 14 years of raising an autistic sister, didn't have that tapping rhythm carved into his bones, didn't have that endless patience. He only had money and power, and both of those were useless in front of the door of his 5-year-old daughter's room as she refused the world. And through those 2 days, through the wooden door, Ash kept hearing one sound again and again, and every time he heard it, it was another knife cutting deeper into his chest. Ruby's voice saying, softly, steadily, without stopping, "June, June, June." She sat there clutching her stuffed rabbit, rocking back and forth, repeating June's name like a spell, like a prayer, as if she said it enough times, June would appear, and Ash sat outside that door with his back against the wall, his head bowed, his hands hanging loose, the most powerful mafia boss in Chicago, sitting on the floor of his own penthouse hallway, listening to his daughter call the name of the woman his family had destroyed, the 10th time, the 50th time, the 100th time, June, 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 and every time was a reminder that he had failed, not only with June, but with Ruby, with Leah, with himself. On the 3rd night, at 2 a.m, Ash was sitting in his office, staring at Leah's photograph on the desk, the one he usually turned face down because he couldn't bear to look at it, when a scream ripped through the silence of the penthouse. Not the familiar scream of "stop," but something wilder, more desperate. The sound of a child who had endured as much as she could endure, and whose limit had finally shattered. Ash ran, not walked, ran through the hallway to Ruby's room, opened the door. And what he saw made his heart stop for one beat. Ruby was banging her head against the wall again and again, her forehead already red, on the verge of bruising, and her hands were clawing at her own arms, little nails dragging across skin and leaving red marks, and the stuffed rabbit lay thrown across the floor, and Ruby's eyes were wide open but seeing nothing. She was somewhere no one could reach, Somewhere the noise and the light and the absence of June had become a storm too large for a 5-year-old body to survive. And this was the worst meltdown Ash had ever seen. Worse than the night at Nero's. Worse than any time before. Because this time it wasn't sensory overload. This time it was loss. It was a child breaking, because the person she trusted had disappeared. Before this, every time Ruby melted down, Ash had called someone. A nanny. A therapist. Knox. Anyone at all. Because he didn't know how, and he was afraid of doing it wrong. But tonight at 2 a.m. there was no one. Only him and his daughter as she destroyed herself. And Ash didn't call anyone. Didn't reach for the phone. Didn't wait. He rushed into the room and held Ruby. Held her tight. Both arms wrapped around the small body thrashing against him. And Ruby fought back. She pushed, hit, scratched, her nails raking across Ash's face. 3 deep lines from his right cheek down to his chin. Blood running, warm and red, across the face of the Mafia boss. And he did not let go. Did not let go even though it hurt. Did not let go even though the blood ran into his mouth with the taste of iron. Did not let go because this was the first time in 5 years he had held his daughter with both arms, instead of handing her off to someone else, and he would never let go again. And then he remembered, between Ruby's screams and the blood on his face, he remembered the rhythm. The rhythm June had taught him. The heartbeat rhythm, slow, steady. And he began tapping lightly against Ruby's back. Not with one finger on a wooden floor the way June had, but with the flat of his palm against the thin fabric of his daughter's pajamas. Tuck, tuck, tuck. Slow, steady, patient, steady. Unbroken, steady. And Ruby kept struggling, kept scratching, but more weakly, little by little, like a storm losing force. The screams becoming sobs, the sobs becoming hiccups, the hiccups becoming ragged breaths, the ragged breaths becoming slow ones. And then she stopped fighting, lying in her father's arms, exhausted, her little body trembling, her face wet with tears. And Ash held her, the rhythm still steady on her back, blood from the scratches on his face falling into Ruby's hair, and he didn't care. And in that dark room at 2 a.m, Ruby whispered, in a voice thin as a thread about to snap, "I want June." 3 words. 3 words from the mouth of an exhausted 5-year-old lying in her father's arms. And those 3 words hit Ash harder than any punch he had ever taken in his life. Harder than the night Leah died. Harder than Reed's phone call. Because his daughter was begging him to bring back the person he had driven away with silence and family secrets. Ash kissed Ruby's forehead, his lips touching the damp heat of her skin, and his tears fell into her hair, mixed with blood. And he said, his voice hoarse and breaking, no longer the boss's voice, no longer the voice of command, only the voice of a father holding on to the one promise that still mattered. "I'll bring her back, baby. I promise." And Ruby closed her eyes in her father's arms, her fingers loosely gripping Ash's shirt, and fell asleep to the sound of that steady tapping on her back. And Ash sat there for the rest of the night, without moving, without sleeping, dried blood on his face, his daughter asleep in his arms, and he knew that in the morning he would go find June, not as a Mafia boss, not with money or power or files or excuses, but as the father of a child who was breaking, and he would tell her the truth, all of it. And if June still walked away after hearing it, he would accept that, but he would not let his daughter wake to one more morning without at least trying. The next morning, Ash laid Ruby down in his own bed, pulled the weighted blanket over her, placed the stuffed rabbit beside her, and turned on the instrumental music June had once played for her through the phone during those evenings at Nero's. Then he called Knox, not to drive, not to come with him, but only to say, "Watch Ruby until I'm back. Don't let anyone in. Don't let her out of your sight." And Knox asked, "Where are you going?" And Ash said, "Pilsen." And Knox went silent for 2 seconds, then said, "You need me to drive?" And Ash said, "No." And Knox stayed silent for 2 more seconds, then said, "You're going alone. To Pilsen." Without a gun, and Ash didn't answer because it wasn't a question. It was Knox confirming that his boss was about to do the craziest thing in 15 years. Go to the most dangerous neighborhood in the city without bodyguards, without weapons, without a bulletproof vest, when at least 3 rival families would gladly pay $1 million for his head. And Knox wanted to object, but he looked at the scratches on the boss's face, 3 dark red lines running from cheekbone to chin. The blood dried there. And Knox understood that the man standing in front of him this morning wasn't the Mafia boss, but the father who had held his daughter all night through blood and tears, and that father was going no matter what Knox said, so Knox only nodded. Ash called a taxi through an app on his phone. Not the Maybach, not the armored car, just a regular taxi. And he wore a gray hoodie, jeans, sneakers, no suit, no Patek Philippe, looking like any ordinary 37-year-old man on the streets of Chicago in the early morning, except for the 3 red scratches on his face and the eyes of someone who hadn't slept, and he carried a black leather briefcase he had spent 2 hours preparing that morning while Ruby slept. 2 hours opening Conrad's old safe in the office, the safe he had never touched since his father died, and taking out everything, every file, every document, every piece of evidence about the Hope Bridge operation Conrad had left behind. The taxi stopped in front of the address on 18th Street in Pilsen at 8 in the morning, and Ash stepped out, looked at the stairs leading down to the basement, the worn concrete steps, the peeling brick wall, the smell of dampness rising from below, and he walked down, each step taking him farther from the world he controlled, farther from bodyguards and armored cars and high walls and surveillance cameras, and closer to the world June lived in every day, the world of damp-stained walls and $847 in the bank and 12-hour night shifts and pain no one paid her to endure. He knocked on the door, 3 knocks, and waited, and the silence stretched long enough for him to think she wasn't home, or that she had looked through the peephole and decided not to open. Then he heard the lock turn, the door opened, and June stood there. Her eyes were swollen, not swollen from crying a few minutes ago, but swollen from having cried for days. Deep circles beneath them, hair tangled and unbrushed, wearing an old oversized t-shirt and sleep pants, and she looked at him without speaking, looked at the hoodie, looked at the scratches on his face, looked at the leather briefcase, and she didn't shut the door, but she didn't invite him in either. She only stood there in the doorway, and Ash looked past her shoulder into the room behind her. Small, maybe 120 square feet. Walls blotched with damp stains, low ceiling, weak light coming through the street-level window showing only the legs of people walking by on the sidewalk. One single bed, one small table, one chair, and on the bed, lying on its side against the pillow, as if someone still placed it there every night, was a teddy bear, old, worn thin, one ear torn and stitched back together with thread the wrong color, Paige's teddy bear, and Ash looked at that bear and thought of Ruby's stuffed rabbit lying on his bed in the penthouse on the 42nd floor. And the distance between those 2 stuffed animals was the distance between 2 worlds his father had created when he decided that land belonging to 200 children mattered less than a casino. June still stood in the doorway, and Ash said, "Can I come in?" And she looked at him for another moment, then stepped aside without speaking. And he walked into the room smaller than his guest bathroom, set the leather briefcase on the table, opened it, and began taking things out one by one and laying them down, not rushing, not explaining, only placing them there. First, the entire file from Conrad's safe, the land transfer papers, the payment records for the health inspector, the handwritten note that said, "Resolved," no trace in Conrad's own handwriting. Second, a photograph, black and white, faintly yellowed, taken on the opening day of Hope Bridge Clinic. In front of the clinic doors, Dr. David Peretti standing there smiling in a white coat, holding scissors for the ribbon cutting. And beside him, a little girl, around 8 or 9 years old, with her hair in a ponytail, both arms raised in excitement, grinning from ear to ear. That little girl was June, and Ash had found the photograph tucked inside the clinic file in Conrad's safe. Conrad had kept it like a trophy. Third, a stack of legal documents Ash had woken the family lawyer at 4 in the morning to prepare, the transfer papers giving full ownership of the entire property at the Hope Bridge Clinic address on the south side of Chicago, from Verano Holdings to June Marie Peretti, already signed, already notarized, only waiting for June's signature. Ash set everything on the table and stepped back without speaking, letting June look, and June moved toward the table, looked at the file, looked at the papers, and then looked at the photograph, and everything inside her that she had been trying to hold together through 3 days of crying alone in the basement room broke open when she saw her father's face smiling from that old print. She picked the photograph up in both hands, gently, as if holding something that might dissolve, and the tears fell, not sobbing, not wailing, just tears running down and dropping onto her father's smiling face, onto the face of the little ponytailed girl with both hands raised in excitement, onto the day when everything had still been whole before Conrad Verano decided to destroy it all. Ash spoke, his voice low, slow, not the boss's voice, not the negotiating voice, but the voice of a man offering the only thing he could offer while knowing it wasn't enough. I can't bring Paige back. I can't bring your father back. But that land was always his, and now it's yours. June didn't look up, her eyes still on the photograph, and said, her voice rough from 3 days of crying, "You think dirt and paper make up for what happened?" Ash said, "No." Honest, without excuse, without circling around it. Only, no, then. But 200 kids who need that clinic can. Families like yours who have nowhere to go can. Silence. Then, and Ruby needs you. And Ash stopped there, his jaw tightening, because the next part was the hardest part. The part where Ash Verano, the man who never let anyone see weakness, had to say it in the damp basement room of the night shift waitress. "And I need you to know I'm not my father." June stood motionless for a long time, the photograph in her hands, the tears still falling but more slowly now, and then she looked up, looked at Ash, looked at the scratches on his face, 3 red lines running from cheekbone to chin, and she knew exactly where those scratches had come from, because she knew Ruby. She knew what a meltdown looked like. She knew that for those scratches to be there he had held his daughter through the storm, and had not let go, and she looked at the hoodie, looked at the sneakers, looked at the taxi, instead of the Maybach, looked at him, standing in her basement room, without bodyguards, without armor, without weapons, looked at him laying the dirtiest secrets of his family across her table, as if laying his own head on the block. And she said, her voice trembling but steady, her eyes locked on his, "I know you're not, because if you were, you wouldn't be standing here." And Ash let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding since the moment he stepped down those basement stairs. And there in the cramped room where Paige's old teddy bear lay on the bed, and the photograph of June's smiling father rested on the tabletop wet with tears, the two of them stood facing each other, not touching, not saying another word, only standing there in a silence that for the first time wasn't the silence of loss or the silence of secrets, but the silence of two people who had seen the deepest wound in each other and chosen not to turn away. And what happened after this moment would change not only their lives, but the lives of hundreds of other families, because that land was about to become what it should have always been from the beginning. 3 months after that morning in the basement room in Pilsen, on a Saturday in early January, when Chicago snow covered the sidewalks in white, but the sky was clear and cold as crystal, Hope Bridge Clinic opened its doors for the second time in its history. And this time, it was no longer the tiny clinic David Peretti had built with donations and hope 18 years earlier. This time it was 3 times larger, taking up the entire piece of land Conrad Verano had stolen and Ash Verano had returned. A 2-story building with a design that was modern but warm, its exterior painted white and pale blue, with large glass doors and windows that let natural light pour in because June had said autistic children needed gentle light, not fluorescent bulbs. And inside there were therapy rooms, a sensory room with padded walls and lights that changed color, a pediatric clinic, a neurology clinic, family counseling rooms, all of it equipped with the most advanced resources Verano money could buy, and completely free for every low-income family. No questions about insurance, no questions about paperwork, no questions except the child's name and what that child needed. Exactly the way David Peretti had run the original clinic, and June had made sure of that, because for the past 3 months, she had worked 14 hours a day beside the architects, doctors, and project managers Ash had hired, and she had no medical degree, no business degree, but she had 14 years of raising an autistic sister, and she knew exactly what families like hers needed when they walked into a clinic, not a 20-page intake form and a cold waiting room, but someone who looked them in the eye and said, "I understand because I've been there." Outside the main entrance, mounted on the white brick wall, was a bronze plaque June had chosen word by word herself, David Peretti Memorial Clinic, and beneath it, in smaller letters, the sentence June had spoken to Ash the second time they met at Nero's, the sentence that had changed the way he looked at his daughter. Because every child deserves to be understood, not fixed. June stood before that plaque on the morning of the opening and touched her father's name gently with the scarred finger of her hand, and she didn't cry, because she had already cried enough. But she stood there for a moment, only her and the plaque and her father's name, before the others arrived. 300 guests came to the opening: doctors, nurses, social workers, families from the South Side and Pilsen and back of the yards and Englewood, neighborhoods the American healthcare system had forgotten, and district politicians, and media representatives. And Knox stood in the corner of the room in the rare suit he wore, watching the crowd with professional eyes, and Ruby sat in the front row in the flowered dress June had chosen for her, holding her stuffed rabbit, drawing with crayons on the paper pad June had placed on her chair early that morning, because June always knew what Ruby needed, before the child even had time to need it. And Felicity Tran was there too, because Ash had invited her by name with a private invitation. And Felicity had come because she didn't dare refuse the boss's invitation, even though she knew, or at least suspected, that Ash had already learned who had sent the anonymous text to June, because Knox had traced the prepaid number through Walgreens security footage 3 weeks earlier. And Felicity walked into the opening reception wearing her usual smile, but her eyes moved across the room looking for an exit on instinct. And then she saw June. Not June in a waitress apron, not June from the night shift with her tired face and neatly tied hair, but June, standing on the speaking platform, the title on the badge pinned to her new blazer reading Director of Family Support Programs, a position created specifically for the one person who understood those families from the inside. And Felicity's face went pale, not pale with fear, but pale with realization, the realization that the waitress she had tried to destroy was now standing on a stage speaking before 300 people, standing beside the most powerful mafia boss in Chicago, standing in the place Felicity had clung to Nero's for 4 years without ever touching. And everything Felicity had done, the false accusation, the anonymous text, the plotting, the digging, had not destroyed June. It had pushed June straight toward the place she belonged. And Felicity understood, perhaps for the first time, that she had lost. Not just lost a battle, but lost at a deeper level, because June had something Felicity had never had and could never buy, a heart people trusted. June's speech was brief. She thanked the team, thanked the community, spoke her father's name, spoke of the old clinic, and did not speak Paige's name, because her sister's name was too heavy to say aloud before 300 people. But anyone paying close attention would have seen her hand touch the scar on her wrist when she spoke about the children we couldn't save, but who teach us how to save, the ones still here. And that was how she spoke of Paige without needing to say her name. Then Ash stepped onto the platform, and the room fell silent in the way rooms always did when Ash Verano entered them. But today the silence was different. Not fear, but anticipation. And Ash looked at the crowd for a moment, then looked at June standing beside the platform, then spoke. His voice, not the boss's voice, not the voice of a prepared speech, but his real voice, the voice Knox had heard once in 15 years, and June had heard more than anyone. My family destroyed this place. I can't change that. I can't undo what was done to the people who built it, to the families who needed it, to the children who lost it. He stopped, breathed in. But I can choose what happens next, and I choose this. This clinic exists because a waitress working the night shift at one of my restaurants taught me something that all the power and money in the world couldn't. She taught me that real power isn't money or guns or control. Real power is the ability to kneel down on a cold floor and listen until a child who trusts no one decides you're safe. The applause was long, but Ash didn't look at the crowd, didn't look at the cameras, didn't look at the district politician clapping for the sake of a photograph. He looked at the front row where Ruby sat drawing with crayons, unconcerned with the 300 people around her, unconcerned with the applause. She only kept drawing. Peaceful, quiet, on the paper pad June had set out for her, and Ash looked at his daughter at peace in the middle of a crowd, because it was the first time she had been in a public place without fear, because June was here, because June always knew what she needed, and he understood that all the money he had poured into this building, all the equipment, all the doctors, none of it mattered as much as the night shift waitress who had knelt on the cold floor of Nero's that night and waited until his daughter allowed her to exist in her world. And that was the kind of thing no amount of money could build, no amount of power could buy, no empire could create. And Ash knew that he wanted her beside him not only for Ruby, not only for the clinic, but for himself too, because she had changed him in a way he had never known he needed to be changed. And the next 6 months would turn what he was feeling now into something he would finally be ready to say out loud. 6 months passed after the opening day, and those 6 months changed everything in the kind of slow way no one noticed until they finally looked back. June came to Ash's penthouse every evening after finishing work at the clinic to read to Ruby before bed, then stayed to drink tea with Ash on the sofa in the living room overlooking the Chicago skyline. And at first, they sat a cushion apart, then half a cushion, then there was no distance left at all. And at first they talked about Ruby, about the clinic, about new patients. Then they talked about Paige, about Leah, about the nights when neither of them could sleep, for different reasons that came from the same source. Then they talked about everything and nothing. And Ash began to realize that he waited for the sound of the doorbell every evening in a way he had never waited for anything in his life. And June began to realize that when she left the penthouse and returned to her basement studio in Pilsen, the room felt emptier than it used to. Not because it was small, it had always been small, but because now she knew what it felt like to be in a place where someone was waiting for her. Ruby was the one who changed most clearly. She started speaking more, not constant conversation like other children, but every week there was another word, another short sentence, and she began drawing every day. Not only people anymore, but flowers, suns, stuffed rabbits, and always 3 figures in every picture. One tall, one medium, one small. And Ash hung every drawing in his office, not on the refrigerator like ordinary families, but on the wall beside the map of the Verano Empire, crayon beside red ink, hearts beside territory. And Knox looked at those drawings every time he entered the room but never commented, only let the corner of his mouth lift slightly, in a way no one would have believed Knox was capable of 15 years earlier. On a Saturday afternoon in July, 6 months after the clinic's opening day, the late Chicago sunlight slanted through the glass walls of the penthouse on the 42nd floor, laying warm gold across the wooden floor, across the sofa, across June's face, as she sat on the living room rug reading to Ruby, and Ash stood in the hallway watching the two of them, June and Ruby, the child's head resting on June's lap, one hand loosely holding the stuffed rabbit, her eyes closed but not yet asleep, and June reading in the small voice she used only for Ruby, the voice Ash had never heard her use with anyone else. And he looked at that scene and knew he couldn't wait any longer, not because he was afraid of losing it, but because he was certain now, more certain than he had ever been about any decision in his life. More certain even than the decisions other people's lives had depended on. And he had been preparing for this moment for 2 weeks, had driven alone to a small jewelry shop in Wicker Park instead of a store on Michigan Avenue, because he didn't want a diamond, didn't want a red velvet box, didn't want anything money could make impressive. He wanted something real, and he had chosen a simple silver ring, no stone, no engraving on the outside, only solid silver, and he had asked the jeweler to carve 2 words inside the band, 2 words that made the jeweler look at him in confusion, but still carve them. 10 feet. 10 feet. The distance between June and Paige on the night her sister died, the distance June had punished herself for during 2 years, the distance she believed was her fault. And Ash had those words carved into the ring not to remind her of pain, but to tell her that the distance was not her fault. It was the limit of circumstance, of poverty, of a healthcare system that abandoned the weak, of a clinic that had been shut down, of everything that had been beyond the control of a 25-year-old girl sleeping 10 feet away from her sister in a basement studio, and that he would never let her face any distance alone again. When Ruby drifted to sleep on June's lap, Ash stepped into the living room, and June looked up at him. And she knew something was different, because his eyes were different, not cold, not burning, but soft in the way she had only seen when he looked at Ruby. And today he was looking at her with that same expression. And Ash knelt down in front of June, right there on the living room rug, the golden evening light falling across his back, and he opened his palm, the silver ring resting there, small, simple, catching the late sunlight without shine or spectacle. No box, no velvet, only the ring in his hand. And June looked at the ring, then at him, and Ash said, "Turn it over." And June picked the ring up with the scarred fingers of her hand, tilted it, and looked inside, and read the 2 words carved into the silver, 10 feet, and everything inside her stopped. Her breathing stopped, her heart stopped, the world stopped, because no one in this world knew about 10 feet except her and Ash. She had spoken that number only once on a bench beside the Chicago River at midnight in October, and he had heard it, he had kept it, he had carved it into silver, not to wound her, but to let her know that he had seen the deepest wound inside her and had not turned away. He had carved it into the ring he wanted her to wear for the rest of her life. And June cried, not the kind of tears she always wiped away quickly and hid, not controlled tears, but real crying, deep crying, 2 years of held-back grief, breaking open all at once, crying because for the first time someone had looked straight at her 10 feet and not said, "It wasn't your fault," in the cheap way people say to comfort, but had said it by carving it into a ring and offering it in marriage, saying, "I know that distance. I carry it with you. I won't let you carry it alone anymore." Ash spoke, his voice low and faintly trembling, because Ash Verano trembled before exactly 2 things in this world: his daughter and the woman crying in front of him. "You saved my daughter. You saved me, and I can't imagine a single day ahead without you." And at that exact moment, Ruby stirred, opened her eyes, and looked at her father kneeling there, looked at June crying, then sat up, slipped her hand into the pocket of her little jacket, and pulled out a daisy that was already slightly wilted. Its petals crumpled, its stem bent. The flower she had picked herself from the planter on the balcony early that morning when no one was looking, then hidden in her pocket all day, careful not to crush it. And no one had known, no one had told her to do that. No one had taught her that when a father proposes, the daughter gives a flower. She simply knew, in the way children like Ruby know things, adults need books to learn, and Ruby held out the wilted daisy toward June with both small hands and said a single word, clearly, firmly, in the voice of a child for whom every word was a battle. But this word came more easily than the others because she truly wanted to say it. "Please." And June looked at the wilted flower in those 2 little hands, and looked at the silver ring engraved with 10 feet in her own hand, and looked at Ash kneeling in front of her with the eyes she had watched change from cold to warm over the past 9 months, and she pulled Ruby into her arms, held her close, buried her face in the child's hair, and said one word, enough and complete: "Yes." And Ruby hugged June back with one arm, her other hand still holding the wilted daisy, and Ash laid his hand across both of them, and the 3 of them sat there on the living room rug in the Chicago evening light, the Mafia boss, the night shift waitress, and the autistic child. 3 people fate should have turned into enemies, but instead turned into a family, and the silver ring engraved with 10 feet rested in June's hand, small, simple, no diamond, no luxury, but heavier than any diamond in the world because it carried 10 feet, carried Paige, carried the night June couldn't save her sister, and carried the promise that she would never face any distance alone again. The wedding took place on a Saturday afternoon in late September, on the rooftop of the penthouse on the 42nd floor, the place where 9 months earlier Ash Verano had looked out at the Chicago skyline and seen only the territory map of his empire. But today he looked out and saw the city where his daughter had touched a stranger for the first time on a restaurant floor, where he had learned how to sit down on the floor, where he had heard about 10 feet on a bench by the river, where he had lost and found again the woman who had taught him that real power didn't live in guns or money, but in the ability to kneel down and listen. 30 people. Only 30. Not the kind of wedding Chicago would have expected from a mafia boss. No hundreds of guests. No limousines. No flowers imported from Holland. No 12-piece band. Only 30 people on the rooftop. Close friends. Clinic colleagues. A few doctors. A few nurses. And the breeze off Lake Michigan carrying the scent of autumn. Ash wore a black suit, perfectly tailored, but on his wrist wasn't the Patek Philippe he had worn for 10 years. It was a Timex watch, $40, brown leather strap, plain white face, the one June had given him 2 months earlier when she had placed it on the table and said, "You need to know real time, not money's time." And Ash had worn it from that day forward, every single day. And today, that $40 Timex on the wrist of a mafia boss who owned a $100 million empire was the small detail only Knox noticed. And Knox looked at the watch, then looked up at his boss's face, and let the corner of his mouth lift. The first time in 15 years, Knox Draper had smiled. Not a big smile, just that slight movement, but enough for the 2 bodyguards standing nearby to glance at each other in astonishment, as if they had just witnessed a miracle. Knox stood beside Ash as the best man, in the only dark blue suit he owned, and he stood there as solemnly and loyally as he had for 15 years. But today he wasn't standing guard, he was standing witness, and in the pocket of Knox's suit jacket was a handkerchief he would never admit he had brought, and would never admit he had used. Ruby sat in the front row in a little white dress with a bow at the back, her hair braided on both sides the way June had braided it that morning, the stuffed rabbit in her lap, crayons in her pocket in case she needed to draw. And she sat still, peaceful, not covering her ears, not hunching her shoulders, because this place was safe, because June was here, because her father was here, because the small world the three of them had built over 9 months surrounded her like the weighted blanket she loved. The officiant read the declaration, short, simple, not ornate, exactly the way June had wanted. And when he said they were officially husband and wife, Ash turned to June, and he kissed her, gently, slowly, in the way he had learned everything from her, gently, patiently, without rushing, without forcing, and his lips on hers said the things Ash Verano would never speak out loud in front of 30 people, said that he was grateful, said that he had changed, said that she had saved him in the way he had never known he needed saving. Then Ruby stood up. No one told her to. No one signaled. No one suggested it. She stood up from her chair on her own, set the stuffed rabbit down, and walked, slowly, one small step at a time, across the rooftop toward June, and all 30 people fell silent, because everyone who knew Ruby knew she never walked toward anyone on her own. She always waited for others to come to her, always kept her distance, always kept the outside world outside, but today she walked, one step at a time, slow but certain, and stopped in front of June, and looked up, and did the one thing she had never done in the 5.5 years of her life. She looked straight into June's eyes, not a glance and then away the way she always had before, not at her hands or her shoulder, but directly, into her eyes, and held the gaze. And in those dark brown eyes, exactly like Leah's, June saw the thing she had seen that first night on the floor of Nero's, when Ruby had placed her finger on the scar, trust. But today it was more than trust, deeper than trust. It wasn't only trust, it was belonging, and Ruby opened her mouth and said, clearly, word by word, in a small voice, but with a certainty strong enough for all 30 people on the rooftop to hear, Mommy. One word. One word Ruby had never had the chance to say to anyone, because her mother had died when she was only 3 months old. One word she had heard other children say, and never understood where it belonged in her own world until today. And one word June had heard before, had heard every day for 14 years. Because Paige had called her that. Paige had no mother, so June had become mother. But June had never believed she deserved that word, because what kind of mother let her sister lie 10 feet away and couldn't save her? What kind of mother bought generic medication because she couldn't afford the real kind? What kind of mother woke up and found her sister already cold? She didn't deserve to be called mother. She had believed that for 2 years, until this 5-year-old child stood before her on the rooftop of the 42nd floor, looked straight into her eyes, and said Mommy, as if the word had always belonged to her, as if no one else in the world could have deserved it more. June dropped to her knees right there on the rooftop in the middle of the wedding and wrapped Ruby in her arms, held her tight, buried her face in the child's hair, and cried, soundlessly, without sobbing, only tears pouring down. And these weren't tears of loss, weren't tears of guilt. They were the tears of someone who had just been forgiven for the thing she had sentenced herself for over 2 years, forgiven not by a judge or a priest, but by a 5-year-old child calling her mother. Ash cried too, standing beside his wife and daughter, tears running down the face of a Mafia boss in front of 30 people. And he didn't turn away, didn't hide them, because he had learned that tears weren't weakness. Tears were proof that he was alive, still capable of feeling, still worthy of standing beside these 2 people. Knox turned his face toward the skyline, pulled out the handkerchief he would never admit to carrying, and wiped his eyes quickly before turning back. The officiant removed his glasses to wipe them, because he couldn't see clearly anymore. And Ruby lay in June's arms, eyes closed, peaceful, her little body completely relaxed, not tense, not rigid, not afraid, peaceful in a way she had never been peaceful before, the peace of a child who had just found the place she belonged after 5 years of searching without knowing she had been searching. That night, after the guests had gone home, the 3 of them sat on the rooftop, the Lake Michigan breeze cool, the lights of Chicago shimmering below them like a million stars fallen onto the earth, Ruby asleep on June's lap, her hand loosely holding the wilted daisy from the proposal that she had refused to throw away. And June looked out over the city and said softly, Paige would have loved Ruby. Ash sat beside her, his hand resting on June's back, and said, Your dad would have been proud of you. And June smiled. And that smile was different from every smile Ash had seen on her lips over the past 9 months, because it was the first smile that carried no pain, no guilt, no 10 feet, only the present, the wilted daisy in the hand of their sleeping daughter, the silver ring engraved with the distance she no longer had to carry alone, and the man sitting beside her, whose family had taken everything from her but who was now trying to return it piece by piece. Because sometimes love doesn't come from clean places. It doesn't come from perfect stories or flawless people. It grows in the ashes, in guilt, in scars no one wants to look at, between a destroyed clinic and 10 feet in the night and a bullet ordered by a father-in-law, and still it grows, still it lives, still it is strong enough to turn enemies into family, and sometimes a child who never knew a mother finds a mother in the heart of the person. Fate should have made her enemy, but that heart is too large for fate to contain, and that love is too real for any darkness to put out. If this story touched your heart, if you felt something move inside you when Ruby said mommy, if you believe love can grow in places that seem impossible, please press like, please share this video with the people you love, and please subscribe to our channel so you can keep listening to more moving stories every day. How did this story make you feel? Have you ever experienced moments in your own life when love appeared from a place you never expected? Please leave a comment below. We read every line and truly want to hear what rises from the deepest part of your heart. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, peace in every day, and the grace to always find love in the most unexpected places. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you in the next video.